there is a case to be made for these things being interpreted in that way. My problem has always been with the dogmatic assumption within ufology that these things always must be extraterrestrial. And in most cases, as you've pointed out, I don't see a physics signature that's sufficient to do that. Let me give you some examples. If you go back to the period of, let's say, from about the time of Roswell up to about 1955 to 1956, and look at the cases of UFO sightings reported simply in the American press. We're leaving out of view here the Canadian, the European, the Australian, the Orient, and so on and so forth. In most of those cases, the top speeds recorded for these craft were said to be around 1,200 miles per hour. All right, and this figure, to me, is very puzzling because it recurs in the literature of that time over and over and over and over, that figure of 1,200 miles per hour. And in fact, I even wrote about that at some length in my book, Roswell and the Reich. Well, the problem with this figure is number one, it's obviously insufficient for any sort of interplanetary technology, much less an interstellar technology. So in other words, the physics there isn't compelling to the idea that these things are extraterrestrial at all. They're just simply very, very advanced craft of some sort that far exceed the normal speed limitations of publicly known human technology of the day. And again, I try and trace some of the Nazi technology that made claim for similar speeds, the work of Dr. Walter Lippisch, who eventually ended up at Wright-Patterson in Dayton, Ohio. So, we've got clear indicators in the literature from that period that while the technology is advanced, while it's exotic, it's not exotic enough to be practical as an interplanetary technology, much less an interstellar one. So when we look at planetary geology of our nearest planetary neighbors at that time, the thinking is, or was anyway, that those planets weren't sufficient to support a large base of intelligent life. So, by the principle of parsimony, we're kind of left with Earth as being the home base for these things. The question is, who's producing it? So that's my argument on the basis of the physics. The only way that ufology has traditionally responded to arguments like that has been to assume a kind of argument from silence, that, these may not be the top performance figures for these craft, and, if they're capable of this, they may have been capable of much more, and so on and so forth. But again, that's an argument from silence, and I think we have to kind of stick to the known facts in these cases and argue from there. So, in answer to the other part of your question as to what I think ufology should be doing, is I think, number one, ufology has to shed itself of its religious components. It's taken on all the trappings of a secular religion. Disclosures replaced revelation, and extraterrestrials and their intentions have replaced, sky gods or what have you. But for all intents and purposes, it has much of the trappings of a religion. I think if it's going to flourish as a field of investigation, we need, number one, a new crop of UFO researchers. I think the old standard names in ufology have done it a disservice by promoting the extraterrestrial agenda so completely without looking very critically at their own assumptions and conclusions. So that, I hope that answers your question, or rather your questions, because they're all good ones, and we could talk all night just on those questions.
I know it would be easy to do so, and I've appreciated your papers on Richard Dolan's work and adding your perspective on that. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
This next question actually comes from Fox, and he says, personally, I would like to know your thoughts on a few subjects in particular. one of which is what you might think about Werner von Braun's last known interview with Carol Rosin in 1974, in which it is said by her that he said, in order to maintain the military-industrial complex, the Russians were going to be the enemy, followed by the terrorists, then the asteroids, and finally, and the final scare would be by extraterrestrials. It is the third enemy that space-based weapons would be built for. So far, first two have come to pass, and it seems that asteroids are becoming more prominent. Obviously, he knew of their plans back then. So what do you think of this?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I refer in several of my books, as a matter of fact, to the Rosen affidavit. I refer to it in Roswell and the Reich. I've referred to it in the Nazi International, in SS Brotherhood of the Bell, and in Reich of the Black Sun. In fact, the only book I've written about the Nazis that I didn't refer to that affidavit, I think, was Secrets of the Unified Field. And I'm incidentally referring to it yet again in the book I'm writing now. So, take that for whatever it's worth as a little clue into one of the things I'm writing now. But
good.
The question raises, I think, and I think what Fox is getting at here is there seems to have been an inside knowledge on at least the part of von Braun that there was some coupling of the idea of this advanced technology and the whole extraterrestrial hypothesis. In other words, the suggestion is being made that this was some sort of deliberate, long-term psychological operation agenda, all right? Now, without giving away details, I tend to that view. And I tend to it for a number of reasons. I think Richard Dolan is laying out in his works and more recently his interviews, I think he's laying out a very, very good and very profound case that his idea of a breakaway civilization is in fact true. My quibble with Mr. Dolan would be very minor, in that I think we're dealing with more than one such civilization, all right? And number two, I think in both cases they have made it part of their, so to speak, their operating principle, that the technologies that they have their hands on are best used in a social engineering fashion. In other words, they have conceived of this technology as a way to re-engineer or restructure human consciousness and culture itself. And to me, that's the scary part of the agenda. You know, if that be so, then what do they want to do? How do they want to restructure human culture and agenda? Well, the disturbing fact is that this is a statement being made, let's face it, by a Nazi. Okay? And I don't think anyone here in this forum would look to the Third Reich as a model for the future for humanity and moral progress. You know? So I look at it. I look at it with a very jaundiced eye. Let's put it that way.
Well, good. What about disclosure?
What can you be more specific?
Do you think there's going to be disclosure soon, or do you think that that's just another agenda as well?
I think it's another agenda. Disclosure to me, Uranus, is very, I go back to my reading of much of contemporary ufology as a religion, all right? And I get into that aspect of things quite a bit in the new book I'm writing as to why that's so, and one of the things that has been present in ufology almost since the beginning is this notion of disclosure. And to me, it's kind of like, the fundamentalists, evangelicals, that come out every few years or so with a date when the rapture is supposed to occur. Well, number one, the rapture isn't any part of early Christian doctrine to begin with. It is in itself a bit of created false expectation. In other words, it's a socially engineered phenomenon. So I look at all the disclosure talk from the standpoint that, this disclosure talk has been going on since the 1950s, and it never seems to get anywhere. But it fulfills, from another point of view, if you look at it as a bit of psychological operation, it fulfills from another point of view an interesting social engineering agenda, because it keeps people distracted, I think, from certain obvious things and looking in places that really aren't too helpful. And one of the things I think it definitely keeps people distracted from is looking at the whole issue of this technology as being terrestrial in nature, and looking for possible scientific rationalizations for how it arose in the actual literature. And I think in that case, it's been a very, very effective tactic on the part of whoever was behind it. So I'm very skeptical of the whole notion of disclosure. I just don't see. Let's look at it this way. If we are assuming, for the sake of argument, that a lot of this technology is terrestrial in nature, then it is a black technology by definition. It's a product of black projects. So in that case, if that be so, I don't see the powers that control that technology as wanting to disclose the fact that it's terrestrial. Because once that idea gets into the popular consciousness, then people are going to start doing exactly what I and others have tried to do, and show that there is a rational scientific basis that you can reconstruct certain dots and connect certain dots in the public literature, beginning back between the period between the world wars and continuing forward to the present. I think they want to keep that out of view, because the other thing we have to remember is that technology then implies two further things. It implies, on the good side, on the positive side, it implies a potential end to our dependence on non-renewable energy resources, number one. And that means an end to the financial monopoly that has basically been the most influential in the West for the last 200 years. So that's the first thing that it implies. But the second thing, and I've said this over and over again, that it implies is a negative thing, a very negative thing. And that is, if you have this kind of technology with the ability to manipulate and engineer the physical medium directly, then if you weaponize that technology, if you apply it to that application, you have a potential weapon that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker. So from the standpoint of the elite, they know this. They know that it would be their worst proliferation nightmare. Forget about Iran having the atomic bomb. It's worse than if Iran would have the hydrogen bomb, because this would be much easier to engineer. It gives you the ability to apply that technology in a weapons platform to manipulate earthquakes, to manipulate weather, and so on and so forth. And once you have that, then you have the ultimate in plausible deniability, because, Mother Nature affords you wonderful plausible deniability if you have a technology that can literally level cities by means of tornadoes or earthquakes and what have you.